Well, there's a well-known article by a fairly famous philosopher who said the distinction between active and passive euthanasia is a distinction without a difference. Both of them involve killing the patient. What is legal now is to give someone enough drugs to treat their pain that it brings on the premature death. But you're not killing them. You're treating their pain, but you're giving them, a potent enough cocktail of pain-relieving drugs, morphine and other things, that it brings on their premature demise. So you say, well, what's the difference between that and just doing what Dr. Scherr did, just giving them, a needle that brings about their immediate death, like you do when we euthanize a pet? What do you think? Well, what I'm saying is, right now, in this day, that is exactly what goes on. And I know people whose relatives were treated in exactly that way. I've read academic discussions that say what you can do is treat the pain with a potent enough drug that it ends up killing the patient. But you weren't out to kill the patient. You didn't give them, potassium cyanide in a syringe. Or some other, lethal pill. But is that a distinction without a difference? Is it a way of allowing, or effectively allowing, active euthanasia in a society, a state, in which it's illegal? Well, you can figure that one out for yourself. But I mean, that's the real world, folks. That's, But you can see how, if someone was to hold that, and yes, I'm sure folks have been told this view, that life is so precious that it could be held on to at any cost. I mean, this was, I think, what went on in the Karen Ann Quinlan. One of the early cases where this, it was a young woman who had been in an auto accident and was on a respirator, and the family really was looking for the right for passive euthanasia, lead off the respirator and they let her die. But the nuns who ran the hospital, thought that life should be preserved at any cost, and wanted to keep her alive. And one of the things that they did was kind of wean her off. There were some things that they did that sort of weaned her off that. So when they finally got the court order that allowed them to take her off the respirator, she did not die. So, but at any rate, the point here is that utilitarian reasoning can justify something like this. Now, look, you guys can do what you like with the marijuana example. He does give, lots of reasons there. It's a little more complicated. Would take some time. But you can see, if you read it or have read it, the types of reasoning for and against, marijuana. And is the pleasure that somebody has, getting high on that kind of a drug, counterbalanced by enough negatives, that it's, should be kept illegal. Uh-huh. Okay, I'm going to take you through utilitarianism today, and we can do some review. I postponed. I had a test. Here's the thing. I originally had a test scheduled for my Thursday night class for this Thursday. Okay, I postponed theirs to next week. And the question is, we can postpone yours and not have it next week, but the week following that. But is that too far? Well, I'm saying that's an option. I'm wanting to get some feedback from people, or we can do some. Well, it's a 3-hour class. We will do some review, but it's going to cover through utilitarianism if we have it next week, Well, okay. I mean, it's fine. I can do either one. If you want to have it only through utilitarianism, we can have it next week. And we'll do some review. Yes, that's what I'll do. I'll bring up a review sheet. I was thinking we might postpone it for another week. In fact, I was thinking it was 2 weeks from today, but, yeah. Well, all right. So let me go through the rest of the current material, and then we'll do some review. Yeah. 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 No. I think I said a couple of things real quick, and you might. What I said is the nuns who ran that hospital where the woman was basically felt that life should be preserved at any cost. Okay, like being Christian. That is not utilitarianism. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So utilitarianism would probably say, yeah, that the cost of keeping her alive, that there was not a sufficient gain in utility. She's not going to have any kind of quality of life again. Yeah, or that sometimes it. Yeah. Well, that the whole point is to provide the greatest good for the greatest number, and it's consistent with saying that you've done that. In some cases, that there might be some segment, call them the few, like the people in that village, who had to be relocated, and those, 10 villages, I think it was, I forget. Or in this case, maybe a patient who you're deciding against, continuing their life. It is consistent with saying, yes, I've made the choice that provides the greatest good for the greatest number, that some sub-segment does not come out for the better. Right? Yeah, that's absolutely true. on a utilitarian perspective. Okay. Well, so we went through this one. And again, we said that it's unrealistic to talk about pleasures and pains in this way, that you really can't assign exact numbers. Now again, what Bentham was getting quite old, and Jeremy Bentham was getting quite old when utilitarianism was getting a lot of criticism, saying, look, you're giving us a moral theory that gives us a very low view of human nature. When Bentham says things like all pleasures are on a par, the only thing that matters is their quantity. And if we get the same quantity, or if the pig out there in the field gets the same quantity of pleasure from eating slop as you do from going to a symphony or reading poetry or doing some highbrow thing, well, that's all that matters, the quantity of pleasure. And they're saying you're reducing human beings to mere creatures of sensation when humans are more than that. And John Stuart Mill tried to take up the mantle, because Bentham was getting old, and defend, literally, they were charged with giving us a pig morality, And so the way John Stuart Mill tried to defend utilitarianism was to say, look, there are pleasures that the pig in the field knows nothing of that human beings can appreciate. And so we do have a philosophy that can recognize the distinction between the things a human being can take pleasure in and the things a non-human animal like a pig can take pleasure in. Right? And so, so he says there are uniquely human pleasures that the pig in the field knows nothing of. And he said these are things like the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination. All these higher pleasures. Of the intellect and the imagination.
So you want us to know how they saw things differently, Jeremy Bentham?
Yeah. And the big word to remember for Bentham is quantity of pleasure, quantity, and for Mill it's quality. He introduces qualitative distinctions. Because one of the things that Mill famously said is, which one of us would trade places with the pig in the field even if we were promised, as Mill said, that the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures? In other words, even if we were promised we're going to be a very happy pig indeed, which one of us would take that deal? And we wouldn't, because there are things we can appreciate as human beings that the pig in the field knows nothing of and has no capacity for appreciating. And so he said that these are more desirable pleasures, these higher pleasures, than the mere pleasures of sensation that we get from eating and drinking and things like that.
Does Mill care about other people's pleasure and things like Jeremy Bentham does or not?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Mill uses the principle of utility, and Mill also agrees with Bentham's statement. This is a famous one. I don't know if your book has it. Each is to count. Bentham, but Mill agrees with this, and this is what your question is directed for. Each is to count for one, but none for more than one. And that really distinguishes utilitarianism from, utilitarianism from egoism, right? For egoism, my pleasure is the whole ball of wax. For a utilitarian, whether it be Bentham or Mill or any other utilitarian, yeah, my pleasure counts. It goes into the mix, right? The uncle's pleasure counted in the decision. But what you're supposed to do as a good utilitarian is to stand back from the situation as if, and make the moral decision as if it didn't even affect you. And yes, your pleasure counts, but no more than the pleasures or pain of anyone else affected by your decision.
What I'm just trying to understand is that the basic difference, definite for quantity versus relative quality. So are you saying that if the quality of the benefit is greater, then he'll go for not the many, he'll go for the few?
No, I think what he's trying to say is that in utilitarian calculations, pleasures with a higher level of quality are more desirable than lower pleasures, even if they have a higher quantity of pleasure. That's what he's trying to say. That the more desirable pleasures are pleasures that we get from things like, working out a math problem, discovering something new, reading or writing a novel or a book or poetry. Yeah. No, but what he's trying to say is if in terms of the pleasures you would consider relevant to your calculations, you would give a higher amount of consideration to higher pleasures. They're more desirable. He says it's better to be Socrates or dissatisfied. In other words, Socrates with a lower quantity of pleasure but a higher quality of pleasure, namely the pleasure from philosophical discussion with his friends. Better to be that than a fool or a pig satisfied who might have more pleasure. Now, in making this distinction, it turns out that he actually abandoned hedonism, the view that pleasure alone is the only intrinsic good, the only thing worth pursuing for its own sake. Because it turns out that if you're saying it's better to have a higher quantity of a lower quality pleasure.
I'm just trying to reconcile what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that in the mix, Mill might give higher numbers to what he called higher quality pleasures than the mere pleasures of sensation. And he also says that those are more worth pursuing as human beings. But, the stock criticism is that Mill claimed to be a hedonist. Remember, hedonists say that there's only one intrinsic good. There's only one thing that's good for its own sake, and that's pleasure. everything else is good only insofar as it promotes pleasure. But in saying that higher quality pleasures are more desirable even though their quantity of pleasure is less, what you're saying is there's something valuable about them in themselves that is not just pleasure. Because their quantity of pleasure is lower, and yet Mill says they're more desirable. Well, that means that there's something else about them that makes them valuable, and it's not pleasure. So if you're saying that, then you're saying, there are other things that are desirable for their own sake, and not just pleasure. So it seems like some other standard is sneaked in by Mill's move, and it would undermine hedonism's claim that pleasure alone is the ultimate standard of goodness. And contemporary utilitarians are like Jonathan Glover in that video we saw. They're pluralists. In other words, contemporary utilitarians say, look, yes, pleasure and happiness are worth pursuing and achieving for their own sake, but there are other goods that are worth having for their own sake alone, and not just because they promote more happiness or pleasure. Things like knowledge in general, self-realization, or the satisfaction of our human wants and preferences. All are viewed by pluralists as equally intrinsically valuable with pleasure. And so the tendency among sophisticated modern utilitarians is to get away from the simple hedonism of Bentham and Mill. And Bentham really wants pleasure to be the ultimate standard. And the biggest utilitarian today, who I think is very much in Bentham's camp and in Bentham's tradition, is Peter Singer. He's pretty much an old-style Benthamite utilitarian. And, you can see some of what he would say if you read this other example on non-human animals. But, the thing to take away from that whole example, we're not going to discuss the whole thing, but Bentham's famous quote is found at the bottom of that small quoted paragraph on 106. If we're asking whether we should extend moral rights to non-human animals, the question is not can they reason. Remember, we saw people like Aquinas and Aristotle try to draw a sharp line between human beings and non-human animals at reason. But Bentham says no. It's not can they reason. Other people have tried to say we're language users, non-human animals are not. And that's what separates us as human beings from them. But Bentham says no, the question is not can non-human animals reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? If they can feel pleasure and pain, we have direct moral duties toward them. And Peter Singer has been an ardent animal rights activist, and one of his talks is there in the extra credit stuff, and he hits on some of those. So again, we've already said that Mill's move in trying to defend hedonistic utilitarianism, he abandons it without knowing it in favor of a pluralistic standard. Now we saw that there were problems with the hedon as a unit of measure of pleasure and pain. It's subjective because it's not open to inspection, to public inspection. It's virtually impossible to define exactly what's to count as one hedon's worth of pleasure or minus one hedon's worth of pain. So that's a problem with Benson's view that we can measure pleasures and pains exactly in hedons. And one thing that solves that problem is taking a different unit. We might not know what a hedon is. In other words, as I said it last time, you don't know whether you have 2 or 10 or 20 of something until you know what's to count as having one of something. And if we don't know what's to count as having one hedon's worth of pleasure, how do we know if we have 2 or 10 or 20? But one thing that solves the problem is to talk in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. And what you were talking about, the example you brought up of the woman who is going to cost society a lot of money if not euthanized. Well, there you might make the decision not just in terms of weighing her suffering, her continued suffering versus euthanizer. Suppose she's in a coma. For all you know, she's not suffering at all. But we're still keeping her alive. But we can get rid of the problem of standardization if we take something like $1 as a countable unit and do a cost-benefit analysis and say that the moral choice is the choice that brings us the most benefits for the least cost. And so utilitarians would say, what benefit, what gain in utility are we getting for keeping this woman alive for another 6 months when she's in a vegetative state? There are costs, but very few, if none, if no identifiable benefits. And of course the opposite side is to say, but human life is precious beyond degree, and don't even talk in terms of dollars and cents. But in this world, it's harder and harder to maintain a view like that. So we can do a cost-benefit analysis. So it weighs the good against the bad. It weighs benefits over costs, and it recommends that the moral thing to do is to act on the side of the most benefits or the least cost to society. Well, we saw that one thing that if you're going to talk about the benefits of utilitarianism, it's a theory that gets us down to earth. It removes morality from the ethereal, right, and otherworldly. Morality for the utilitarians isn't following the dictates of a transcendent God, following the will of God. It's not thinking that there are somehow universal moral principles built into the fabric of the universe like Plato and Socrates seem to think. But instead, morality is a simple matter of promoting promoting pleasure and lessening pain for real people in the real world we live in. And unlike egoism, it allows us to take the moral point of view. Now, taking the moral point of view is that point of view that allows you to make a moral decision from the standpoint of an objective, disinterested observer, and say, hey, let's forget about how this affects victim morality. What's the right thing to do here? And the right thing to do might not be the choice where victim morality comes out with the best set of circumstances. So utilitarianism allows us to stand back from a situation and ask, what's for the greater good of all concerned. So it allows us to take this disinterested position that some philosophers call taking the moral point of view. And of course it's straightforward and objective, and it realizes that real morality should make a difference in the world. Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that available on Blackboard for you, and I'll do that. Yeah, it will. And I'm going to do that before I leave tonight. I'll make it available. I was tied up with something, and I didn't know if we were going to postpone the test, since I postponed my other one to next week. But no, we'll have it next week, and we'll go through utilitarianism. We'll leave Kant for the for test 3. Pardon? Yeah. Okay. Well, we're, some of the objections are ones we've already gone over. That sometimes it's hard. What utilitarianism wants us to do now is project future consequences. And we already saw with something like the Bakun Dam, it's hard to weigh all of them. So even though the principle of utility seems very simple, in practice, utilitarianism can be very complicated, right? Where do you stop weighing consequences, right? And of course, if we're talking about a hedonistic type of utilitarianism, very hard to predict others' pains and pleasures. No, the uncle would come out with different reasoning if he reasoned that his nephew isn't going to like the circus, but he's going to love staying home and reading that novel. Then maybe the moral thing to do would be for him to stay home. We're often comparing very diverse pleasures with utilitarianism. And we already saw, I'm not going to go into this subtle point, but people like Peter Singer have argued, for instance, that on utilitarian grounds, since you would produce much more good by not spending $3,000 on a new flat screen for the fall football season, but instead taking that money and using it to alleviate pain and suffering in third world nations. Basically, Peter Singer and other people have argued that it's not a discretionary duty to give a large part of your income to that kind of charity, but if you're going to be consistent utilitarian, you ought to see it as your moral duty to do so. In other words, if you're going to achieve less pleasure and happiness from buying that $3,000 state-of-the-art three-dimensional flat screen, then you would produce by giving that $3,000 to something like World Vision for food aid, then your duty as a utilitarian is to give that money, So it's turning what a lot of people think is a discretionary duty. In other words, something that's good to do, but we shouldn't feel like it's our duty to do. Utilitarians turn some discretionary duties, like giving food aid to the third world, into mandatory duties if they produce more pleasure than pain.
or more happiness than the happiness we'd have using that money for what we want to use them for. Sometimes it can recommend immoral actions. Richard Taylor on Act Utilitarian Grounds has argued that if there's more pleasure produced by having love affairs than not, then we're morally justified in doing so. But you say, I'm going to cause a lot of mental pain and anguish if my spouse ever finds out. Well, Richard Taylor says, well, that's okay. On utilitarian grounds, you're also entitled to lie about the affair. So, okay. Well, what I've decided to do is I'm not going to go into a distinction between act and rule utilitarianism, even though sometimes I like to do it. It's given in your book, but many people think that a lot of the criticisms and the counterintuitive moral results of utilitarianism come from act utilitarianism. An example of that is that case that we use to illustrate going to the circus or reading the book, where you work out the numbers for a particular action. And rule utilitarianism says, no, we should be following general moral rules. And we don't bring in the principle of utility directly to evaluate every individual act. We bring in the principle of utility to say what moral rules are the best overall for society as a whole. For instance, act utilitarianism would militate in favor of forcing somebody against their will to be euthanized if keeping them alive produces more costs and benefits to society. But you can say, well, but would that be best for society as a whole if we, did that and we had a rule like that? Sometimes we can justify on act utilitarian grounds punishing somebody. There's a case in your book. It's a classic example that's given. If you could put up a patsy, claim that they're responsible for something when the crowd is yelling for blood, and have them executed for a crime they didn't commit when you knew they were innocent, because you would stop a riot where a lot of lives would be lost. On act utilitarian grounds, it looks like you're justifying in killing somebody who's innocent just to prevent the riot. Whereas we could say on rule utilitarian grounds, rules in society that allowed for the punishment of people who were innocent would not make it a better society, a happier society overall, so we shouldn't have them. But I'm not going to ask you questions about that distinction. Okay, what I'd like to do is just take 5 or 10 minutes, because I want to bring up something and take a break, and I need a drink of water, and then we'll do some review. Okay, so if you want to break, let's take 10 minutes. It's 7:08, and then we're going to do some review. While we're doing that. So, yeah, I thought maybe the best thing to do would be to go back over this PowerPoint and stop me. If you have questions you don't understand. Remember, we're doing two things in egoism. We're looking at this very old, listen, this goes back to Plato. This is discussed in Plato's Republic. This very old psychological theory that the only thing that motivates us is acting in our own self-interest. That we're not motivated unless we see something in it for us, And I find that it's not hard for me to persuade students of this view. For some reason, people naturally want to say, well, of course. But we saw that there were some problems with this, But again, it's psychological egoism is a psychological theory, but it may be a very unscientific psychological theory because it seems like there's no way you could test it, and we'll see this, Well, yes, but the psychological egoist is going to say, well, the motive you think you had, that you really cared for those people, and that was your chief motive, why, that's an altruistic motive, and we never act from altruistic motives. That's what my theory of psychological egoism says. So you must have had a self-interested motive. Did it make you feel good to do that? Yeah. Well, your real motive was that. It wasn't the motive you think it was. Well, doesn't that take a little bit of chutzpah to tell somebody, well, look, what you think was your motive is wrong. You really you had to act in self-interest because my theory says we can only act in self-interest. There's something wrong with that. Yeah. Or well, one of the ways that people make that distinction is that in terms of what really motivates us, psychological egoism says, as a matter of fact, we do act in our own self-interest. The theory of ethical egoism says that we ought to act in our own self-interest. And ethical egoism can be held even if somebody rejects psychological egoism. But very often, ethical egoism says we ought to act in our own self-interest. And you can be an ethical egoist even if you reject psychological egoism.
But we still to act in our own self-interest
but many...
first.
Yeah. Well, it says that my moral duty is to act in my own self-interest. Yeah. In other words, that's what I ought to do. And psychological egoism says that's what we always do anyway. Yeah, that it's a matter of fact. Whereas the ethical theory says, ethically, that's what we ought to do. Psychological egoism says it's just a matter of fact that that's what we do. Yeah. Exactly. That's the way we're constructed as human beings. We always look out for number one.
Right. No matter if it's something that we're going for the better, someone else will still get something good about it.
Exactly. See, that's where it's hard to prove this theory false with a counterexample, because I can say, well, I really acted from an unselfish motive when I stopped what I was doing and helped that old lady across the street, or when Lincoln picked those piglets out of the
But
mud.
you think
You know,
it could have been,
but the psychological egoist can always say, well, was there any benefit to you? Did it make you feel good? You know? Yeah. Yeah, and see, Bishop Butler would have said, Lincoln, you're wrong. The person who didn't care about those pigs wouldn't have felt bad at all just leaving them there in the mud. You really had an altruistic motive, Lincoln. You cared about the welfare of those pigs, you know, despite the fact that you know, in other words, Butler thought that the psychological egoist gets things backwards. They say if you get satisfaction from something, then that's your motive, whereas really it's only the person who's looking out for others' interests that gets satisfaction from serving others. Yeah.
about the moral and the ethical. Because the moral one is in that's the motive side. The ethical is in the we ought to do. Is that the difference between those two?
Yes. It's saying that the moral truth, not just for me, it's not subjective, right? It says the moral truth for everyone is that they ought to be pursuing their own self-interest. You know, yeah. So the ethical theory talks about what we morally are obligated to do, what we ought to do morally. The other just says, look, here's the truth about what motivates human beings. We're only motivated by doing things in our own self-interest. You know, so one's a theory of human motivation or motives. The other is an ethical theory. Yeah, exactly. You had your hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, okay. Well, there's nothing trivial, or maybe everything's trivial. I don't
Are
know.
you going to want us to
But-
be familiar with the Hobbes argument?
But if it comes to you. Okay, now, we're not doing social contract theory, so that, I mean, there's another chapter on Hobbes and the state of nature and all that. Yeah, no, which specific Hobbes argument?
Well, I read this, one was in the bill that we have read and went over, and I was curious if you wanted
Oh.
for a type 2, or if this can be something for type 3.
Yeah. Okay. We're not going to cover social contract theory,
Okay.
and I'm not sure where I put that in there. Okay. No. I believe you if you say it is. But
Yeah,
I.
6.1, we were supposed to vote that on October 15th.
Okay.
6.1 in our book was on the social contract theory.
Oh, you know what? I'll bet you. Remember, some of this was from the old book. I did this up before I ever got a copy of yours. So I think the chapters were different. In other words, chapter 6 in the new one is social contract theory. But I think chapter 6 in my older version was
Social contract
what?
theory.
Oh, yeah. But I think chapter 6 was something else. Let me see what I had as chapter 6, because I think it was something else. Remember, I don't think I revised everything. Oh, let's see, chapter 6. Yes. Yeah. In the older book, chapter 6 was the chapter on ethical egoism. Okay. And I think he laid them out, the egoism chapters, a little differently in this book. Yeah. So my apologies that was confusing.
About the prisoner to eliminate everything that's
That nothing on that. Nothing on the state of nature. Nothing on their being all at war with one another. One of the arguments in favor of the psychological view is that we always do what we want, and if there are wants, well, doesn't that mean we're always acting in our own self-interest? We're always acting selfishly. But, there are a couple of things you can say. We don't always do what we want. Sometimes we do what we think is the right thing in spite of what we want. Right. Yeah, so sometimes we act from obligation. So we don't always do what we want. But basically, the point that Bishop Butler made 200 years ago is that what makes a want a selfish one is not that it's something I want. It's not that it's my want, but it's the object of what I want. And what I want could genuinely be someone else's good. In other words, if it's the object of my want, instead of wanting something for my own benefit, I could want something more for somebody else. What Butler said is, if we define whether or not a want is selfish, not by the fact that it's my want, but by its object, then even if it's my want, it doesn't mean that my wants are always selfish. My wants can be directed at the good of another person, primarily. So he's saying psychological egoism is wrong there. But Butler's point was the point that's made in this slide. Even if our wants are our wants, it does not follow that all of our wants are selfish. What we want might be another's good, right? Right. In other words, we talk in terms of English, subject, verb, object, right? John hit the ball. I want X, where X is the object of my want. Well, X doesn't always have to be something that's selfish. X can be the good of another person, And so he says, just because it's something I want, it doesn't mean that that's a selfish one. What defines whether it's selfish or unselfish is the object of the one. And if I desire primarily somebody else's good, then that's an unselfish one. And so that argument doesn't work. That's Butler's point against psychological egoism. Yes, that just because our wants are our wants, it does not follow that our wants are always selfish. We could want something that's altruistic, that's somebody else's good. But remember, what I said that psychological egoism says is not that all people act selfishly some of the time, and it's not that some people act selfishly all the time. It's basically that all people act selfishly all the time. That's the only thing that motivates them, genuinely. And so if that's true, this is what follows, that we can never act from a genuine altruistic motive, one that puts the good of another above our own good. If we always act from non-altruistic, self-interested motives. And there's where we get into whether or not you can provide a counterexample to it by saying, well, here's Mother Teresa, working with the poor in India. Isn't she, doing good that's altruistic? What's selfish about that? What about B. Gaddy helping the homeless and feeding them down in Baltimore City when she was alive? But some people could say, well, yeah, but she probably felt good about it. She even ran for public office at one time. So psychological egoists say that all of our motives are self-interested. And here's the thing. The theory can always cop out. Whenever you present it with what seems to be a counterexample, what seems to be an example of somebody acting in an unselfish way, they can always say, but wait a second, there must have been some benefit they received from doing what they were doing. And if there was, then their motives had to be to receive that benefit because they had to act selfishly.
So
Right.
there were some people who were doing it for a self-interest and for being helpful. So they kind of multiple.
Well. See that. Yeah. See that's an interesting point because, they always want to say that the motive that made me decide to do it would have been the selfish motive, but it's true. I mean, you can have both, right? I mean, you can genuinely care about someone and help them and just totally be focused on them, but afterwards you really feel good about what you did, and it's a benefit to you, yeah. So, well, yeah. Well, so at any rate, even if it's just a psychological benefit, psychological egoists could always say that if you received any benefit, psychological or otherwise, that your real motive, what motivated you to perform that action, must have been to receive that benefit.
Are the presentations going to be the week after?
Okay. When did? Okay, November 19th. That's fine. That would be good. We'll do that. That would be good. Let's keep it what people have been planning toward. Yeah. No. That's it's going to change the way the syllabus is currently written, but that's okay. Look, I'm not going to ask you a lot about Mill. There might be a question, but what he said is, look, just because the steamship burns coal going across the Atlantic, it doesn't mean that that's the reason it went across the Atlantic to just burn that coal. And the analogy is, just because we receive satisfaction from doing something, it doesn't mean that our main motive for doing it was just to get that psychological satisfaction. That's all. But you can see it was John Stuart Mill who said this against egoism, that he was arguing against egoism, right? But that's a subtle one. Yeah, Mill was, right. Definitely Bentham would have, too. And we're going to see Kant argues against egoism. Kant is very much a defender of individual rights in a way that the utilitarians wouldn't agree with. But Kant is still very against ethical egoism. Now, there's going to be nothing on Kant on this test. That's going to be afterwards. We'll do. But again, here's another point that Butler made. It's only the person who genuinely cares for others who's going to receive satisfaction from helping them at any kind of a deep level. The person who just does it out of duty may not get... in other words, he thinks that ethical egoism gets it exactly backwards. That it's because we're acting from an altruistic motive, where we really care for somebody else, that we get a feeling of satisfaction. It's not that we're doing what we do to get the feeling of satisfaction, like the egoists claim. So that's why the criticism is that psychological egoism gets things backwards. Well, okay. The egoists say if we receive any benefit, even if it's just satisfaction, that was our real motive, not an altruistic motive, like really caring for those people. What Bishop Butler tried to say is it's only people who really genuinely from the heart care about other people who are going to receive satisfaction from helping them. And so it gets it backwards. That they're really acting from an altruistic motive of caring from somebody, and that's why the satisfaction comes, but they're not doing it to receive satisfaction. There's something called the paradox of hedonism, that very often, pursuing pleasure is not the best way to get the most pleasurable life. Forget I said that. We're not going to go on. Now, as I said, it's not a testable scientific theory. It's, the famous philosopher Karl Popper, famous philosopher of science, said, I don't care where you get your theories from. He said you can get your theory in a dream. What makes it a scientific or an unscientific theory is, can it be tested empirically? Could we state under what conditions we could prove it false? What would have to take place in the world for your theory to be false? He says a lot of pseudoscientific theories can find confirmations in everything that happens. But he says the real test of a scientific theory is what would have to happen in the world for your theory to be proven false? And psychological egoism seems to be the kind of theory where nothing can happen that would prove it false. Because we're all, whatever example we make, we can always cite some kind of benefit that we say is their real motive, which means that their theory is held on to in spite of any counterexample, in spite of any evidence to the contrary, kind of by fiat. What do you mean?
I think obviously the psychological aspect of it are easy.
Mm-hmm.
I would believe ethical egoism or for that more than psychological. It's just obviously not true that people do in fact only act out of their only
Always act for themselves. Yeah. Yeah.
Not true. Strong. Like psychology, you can kind of say, yes, they really only acted for that. You know what I'm saying? So it really is
Yeah.
like, you can tell us if they really do not. And I think it's just because you can't dispute it, because that's why they still hold on to it, like, oh, we're right now.
Yeah. But the point is, it's not a strength of a theory that no possible observation can disconfirm it. That just shows that it's not a testable scientific psychological theory. So, okay. Right. And I make that point in that slide. Well, so ethical egoism basically is a consequentialist theory that says our only obligation is to promote for ourselves the greatest balance of good versus evil. Okay. So at any rate, yeah. Well, we took a slight break, so normally we go to 8:25, and we took like 15 minutes, so we'll go to 5 or 10 after. As I said, the connection between the psychological view and the ethical view is in the cliche that ought implies can. If we're constructed, in other words, it can't be our moral duty to do what's impossible for us. And if psychological egoism were true and the only thing we could do is act in our own self-interest, then why shouldn't that be our one and only moral obligation? So that's how people tie the two together. That's why we study the two together. If ought implies can, then why isn't it that acting in our own self-interest is the only thing morally we ought to be required to do, right? But again, you can go back to the criticisms of psychological egoism. So we saw how Ayn Rand supports this as fostering independence, promoting self-sufficiency, encouraging creativity, and altruism as fostering dependence. She's more ethical. Yeah. Ayn Rand, I've heard people say she's not a psychological egoist, but she's an ethical egoist. In other words, she defends ethical egoism because she thinks no moral theory does a better job of looking out for individual rights. In other words, egoism is the best moral theory for defending the rights of the individual person against having those rights overridden by the collective. In the way that yeah.
And who's this person's name?
Ayn Rand, A-Y-N-R-A-N-D. Ayn Rand. Yeah. So she thinks altruism fosters dependence. The altruist needs someone to give to or needs to be given to by someone, is parasitic. Both giver and receiver are parasitic on one another, and it encourages borrowing. And one criticism of her is her idea of an egoist as this seminal, creative person. It's like, how many people in history is that really true of? I mean, there's a reason why people like Thomas Edison stand out as and Einstein as unusually creative people, and Bill Gates and people like that. Yes. Uh-huh. So, you can also defend it by evolution, that it's the best way for us to promote our own survival, is for us to foster our own self-interest. Go ahead.
On this study guide, you're going to put all of these names of all of these people. It's really hard to keep track of all of the people that you're going to throw.
Well, I mean, really, there aren't too many people. I mean, I'm not gonna ask you whether Bishop Butler said anything. Okay. I mentioned that to give you some historical context for the statements that are in there in the PowerPoint. He was the author of some of the ideas that the textbooks use but don't attribute to him. Ethical egoism, there aren't as many, names, well, I'm looking mostly for your understanding the basics of the view rather than who held it,
We might see people like Bill, Beckler, on the test.
Yeah, there will be some questions on Rand, but not an overly large amount. Yeah, but here's the one thing. I don't know if I went over some of the objections. But, I mean, you're claiming that this is a theory that gives you the universal truth about morality. But here's the thing. Some people think ethical egoism could conflict with itself. I mean, would it really be in my self-interest to want you all to be egoists? You know, it might conflict with my interest to advocate egoism as a universal moral theory. And so, in other words, in cases where your interest would conflict with mine, then it might be against my interest to advocate that you be an egoist, an ethical egoist, and yet here's a theory that I'm supposed to be selling as a universal moral theory. Now you can get around the contradiction by saying I ought to be an egoist secretly, but advocate altruism publicly. But that's a strange position to take. But here's it's supposed to be a universal moral theory, but is it really in my self-interest to advocate that you all be egoists? You know? No, and so it seems to conflict with itself to push it as a universal moral theory. Now, here I think is one of the more important criticisms. It makes ordinary advice-giving practices kind of irrelevant. I mean, there are a number of times when we go to somebody for advice, trusting that they're going to give us advice in our best interest, whether it's a business advisor, a doctor, somebody who's going to do repairs on your car or your home. But the only consequences that are morally relevant to an ethical egoist are the consequences for themselves. The consequences to somebody else, whether they be good or bad, are morally irrelevant. And the problem there is, why couldn't an unscrupulous ethical egoist auto mechanic recommend a repair that's a $1,000 repair that I don't need when all I need is a $200 one, simply because they come out better, but I come out worse. But the theory of ethical egoism says that if Mr. Badwrench recommended a $1,000 repair job to me, then my the fact that I came out worse is morally irrelevant to Mr. Badwrench, right? The only thing that matters was the consequences for him, and he made more money. He came out better. And any moral theory that has that seems to have something seriously wrong with it. No contradiction, like all swans are white, but there's at least one non-white swan, can be right. There's a direct contradiction. So some say that egoism encourages predatory behavior, putting my interest above everyone else's and riding roughshod over their interests. Now, here's the thing. Ayn Rand's response to this criticism is, look, true egoists, true creators, don't ask anything from anybody, and they're not out to give anything to anybody. In other words, they're just independent and kind of lone wolves, right? And she says predators are really dependent. They're not altruists, but predators are not true creators because the predator needs a victim. Predators need to depend on their victims. So they're not the independent, self-sufficient model of the creator, which is her model of an ethical egoist. And my own view on that, and look, this is Vic Morawski's view, and I don't, I never ask a question about this, is that Rand's creative, self-sufficient, independent, ethical egoist may be a subset of the egoist, but, you know, the unscrupulous, predatory auto mechanic is also an ethical egoist. Ethical egoism seems to require only that one be morally obligated to put one's own interests first. The other characteristics of Rand's creative egoist, like creativity, self-sufficiency, independence, I think are unrequired additions to the theory of ethical egoism. In other words, I think the stock criticisms of ethical egoism still hold. She says, well, my creators are not predatory in that. Well, maybe they're not. Maybe Thomas Edison wasn't predatory. Now, if you're talking about Bill Gates, maybe not. You know, try to see how many people are using word perfect around. You know, I mean, you can be both creative and predatory, but the point is, you know, I think you can be an ethical egoist just if you think you're morally obligated to put your interests first, and you don't necessarily have to be the kind of seminal, you know, independent, creative individual that Rand pictures egoists as. In other words, I think some egoists fit Rand's model, but there are plenty of egoists who don't, and they're all egoists. And there are some criticisms of the theory. Maybe they don't work for Rand's creators, but they work for other egoists, and some egoists are predatory. You know, like the corporate raiders, like you know, the famous Gordon Gekko of Wall Street. You know, he's a good example of a predatory egoist, right? He wants to buy companies and break them up, put people out of work, simply because they're worth more broken up. You know, he's just predatory. So, again, I never asked a question about this subtlety, but it's just for your thinking. Okay, I'm going to get to work and do that before I leave. Sorry I didn't have a printout, but it'll be up in an hour or two on Blackboard. And
Can I ask you a question? How many questions
yes.
are we having on the page?
It'll be the same as before, 25 objective questions for 2 points each, and just one essay out of the essay sheet, off of the essay sheet.
So you're going to post that thing as well?
The essay sheet I hope to have up, you know, before I leave tonight.
So
Also.
that's the one shot at the time, or is that the following one?
Pardon?
Are you rescheduling it, or we keeping it?
No. Everything's going to be next week.
So the essay is due next
So the essays due next week, the day of the test,
Okay.
and then we'll do as well.
Right.
We'll do the objective, and then we'll look at some on time. Yeah. Well, normally I don't let them, you know, take stuff. Yeah. Well, right. At least one of them was
You understand what I'm saying?
genuinely ill, and most of the time I do send people to test them. And we probably will do that this time.
I just wanted to find out, are you going to post the study guide also with the test questions?
Well, yeah, I'm going to do both.
Okay.
I'm gonna do that.
All right,
okay?
okay, that would be helpful, okay.
So,
So where should we check it? Is it tonight, is it gonna be on, Blackboard?
well,
tonight?
I'm
Is it
gonna
be
try to
tomorrow
get it
morning?
up within the next hour or two on Blackboard.
Okay, I'll check again. I'll check, tomorrow morning. All right, thank you.
Okay.